Okay, so this is Introduction to Statistical Learning, Chapter 11. Oh, that should be Chapter 11 there, not 10. And we are on the very first question. And the first question gives us A through I, different scenarios, and we are meant to determine whether or not the censoring mechanism is independent, and then to justify our answer. Um, so, so we'll go through these, and I guess my experience of going through these is that which ones are independent and which ones are not will depend somewhat on the things you read into the question. And that's really the nature of what it is for these mechanisms to be independent or not. So maybe I'll just say a brief word about that. So for the most part, you can't look at data and determine whether or not something like a censoring mechanism is independent of the outcome in this case. It's something that you have to bring to the data. It's something that you have to base on your understanding of how a system works. And so, so some of these questions I think are, or these scenarios are a little bit difficult to answer in one uniform way, because I think it's going to depend somewhat on how you read the prompt and read into them. So, so first, just a generic idea here, or thoughts that apply to each of the answers. So, what does it mean for our censoring mechanism to be independent? And I think specifically what is implied here is specific of the outcome. And what I think is the default way to think about this, but which is not correct, is to ask, does this mechanism have anything to do with the outcome in a mechanistic way? So does how old the patient is depend on what their health status is going to be at the end of the study? Okay. Now, it may be that sensory mechanisms that are related to the outcome are not independent of that outcome, but that is not always the case, and it is not always the case that a non-independent censoring mechanism seems to have anything to do with the outcome on a mechanistic level like that. And so what I think a better way of trying to filter what is independent versus not independent is to ask something like what I've bolded here, okay? Which is, after you apply the censoring mechanism, do we expect the resulting data to be statistically indistinguishable regarding the questions that we're interested in from the data had that censoring mechanism not occurred? Okay, and this is a broader idea, a broader sense of independence, but I think it kind of gets more to the heart of what we want, right? Whatever the censoring mechanism is, we want to make sure that it hasn't biased the data. That's what's important here. Not whether or not there's necessarily a story about how that mechanism is related to the outcome, say. Okay. So, for example, this first one, I think that a lot of people have different answers than me here, but hopefully you can see that idea working in the background here. So in a study of disease relapse, a careless scientist accidentally removes all patients whose phone numbers begin with 2, or they're lost to follow-up, I should say. They're censored. So I think that a lot of people will answer that this is independent, because what does phone number have to do with relapse? And that's very true. But when I read this, what I think is phone numbers are usually assigned geographically, or there may be some socioeconomic component. And so if all of a sudden we remove everybody with 2, whose phone number begins with 2, that's important, phone numbers begin for very specific reasons having to do with geography or maybe providers. I don't know what the first number is, if it's the area code or if it's the first of the 7-digit number, but either way, um, that probably represents something of a distinct subpopulation. And by just removing all of those, you may be biasing the data. And so this first one, I am saying that it is probably not independent. Even though phone number probably has nothing to do with relapse, phone number may have to do with other variables related to the patients, such that if you remove those, a subset of those patients, you now have a biased sample. Okay, now to B, again, here in B, I think that I'm probably reading in things that other people are not reading in, and that's probably okay, but maybe what's important is just the thought process here. So now in a study of longevity, a formatting error causes all patients that exceed 99 years to be lost. So in other words, we know that they're older than 99 years, but we don't know their exact ages. Okay, so I think that the safe answer here is that this is not independent. But one thing that strikes me here is that this is not censoring, at least not in the same way that censoring has typically been discussed in this chapter and in the rest of these questions, because we still have the data from all of these patients, but it's just that some of their data is a little bit off, and not all the patients' data are a little bit off. It's a particular subset, and it's not even and it's incorrect in a particular direction. If it says 99, they're at least 99. Okay, so that would mean that we probably can't generalize beyond 99 years old for whatever the results of this study are. But that's assuming that a 99-year-old is really that much different than a 100-year-old or a 101-year-old, right? It may be that their expected life remaining at any of these ages is the same, or something. I mean, it could be like that. I don't know. Or it could be that the way that this study gets analyzed is that the ages are bend, right? And so you may have 50 to 60, 60 to 70, and then 99 and above, right? And in that kind of analysis, it's hard to say that the results would necessarily be biased. But nevertheless, I think that a safe answer here is probably not independent. Okay, C is pretty straightforward. Really sick patients are lost to follow-up. Okay, well, that one's pretty straightforward. If we're removing the sickest patients from the population, then we're probably biasing the data. But maybe what's interesting here is, again, why is that biasing the data? Why is that mechanism not independent? And the way that I think about this is because by removing a section, or by removing a subset of the population, then are we left with a cohort that is statistically indistinguishable from had we not removed them, and at least in the areas that are of interest in the study? Well, in this case, probably not. If we're removing really sick patients, well, then, and we're studying longevity, well, then, yeah, we're probably left with a cohort that lives longer than the larger cohort that we began with. So, okay. All right, so now in part D, in a study of unemployment duration, people who find work earlier are less motivated to stay in touch with the study investigators and therefore more likely to be lost to follow-up. This is, this is not independent, of course, very much for the same reasons that C was not independent, but there is something a little bit interesting here, which is that in this case, a fair portion of the censoring is because the outcome of interest was attained, and so I don't know if there's something that a investigator could do with that information. I suspect some weak things that they could do with that. But anyway. Okay. In part E, this is very much like the previous two questions, but now we're talking about pregnancy duration, and women who deliver their babies preterm are more likely to do so away from their usual hospital, and so therefore they are censored. Um, so this is, you know, just like studying longevity and removing the sick patients is biasing. Here, studying pregnancy duration and removing preterm babies, or mothers and babies, or births, would definitely bias your resulting population, right? In other words, you're removing a section of your data, and then what you're left with is probably going to be really different than your initial set of data. But in this case, there is something a little bit interesting, which is it seems that it would not be that difficult to, after the fact, go and obtain all of the necessary information. So, right, because you know, so this is not like the unemployment situation where people just don't want to keep in touch with the investigators. You know, these women presumably are they had no, you know, they had no choice where they were going to deliver their preterm babies. So they may be, you know, still willing to interact with the investigators. You know, this is me reading into the question again. Okay, part F. There are residents in a small town, and the ones that enroll in college out of town are more likely to be lost to follow-up. So we want to know if that is biasing to years of education. Well, yes, of course, this is going to be biasing to years of education if we're studying how many years of education the residents obtain, because those that are going to school out of town may go to school for longer or shorter, and in fact the question or the prompt says they're also more likely to attend graduate school, so therefore they're probably obtaining more education. So if I remove them from the data, well, now I have a statistically different data set. I should also maybe float the idea here that that this scenario where residents that we're losing them to follow-up if they move out of town, if they move out of town for education, the outcome of interest here does not really even necessarily have to be something related to education, right? We are removing residents from our data set based on where they went to school. But let's say that instead of years of education, this was something related to education, such as how much money they make or something like that. And education is probably linked to how much money you make. Okay, but it could be something else. It could be something like prevalence of diabetes or you know, of some health condition, and so even though them moving or not moving may have at best have very weak threads that you know that we can imagine to their health status, it could still be biasing, right? It could still be the case that that we have by removing out of towners, that we all of a sudden have a subset of the original data that is statistically different in terms of, in this case, diabetes or something, than had we not removed them from the data set. Okay, here in G, we have researchers conducting a study on disease-free survival. So that's just how long they go before a disease pops back up again, maybe cancer or something like that. And patients who have not relapsed within 5 years are considered to be cured, and therefore their survival times their survival times are then censored at 5 years. Um, I'm a little bit conflicted on this, and so maybe other people have ideas. Um, but uh, but at least with one reading of this prompt, it would seem that really what they're doing is just saying, well, these patients have reached the desired endpoint, right? 5 years of disease-free survival, right? That could be defined as the endpoint. In which case, I don't really know if it's called censoring. Then it is, because the recorded data point for an outcome is whether or not they were censored, and if they're not censored, then what that outcome was. And it seems like this could be an uncensored outcome wherein their obtained outcome was, they were disease free. So this one I'm a little bit uncertain on, and well, I think it depends again on how you're reading the question. Okay, now finally in sections H and I, we have similar scenarios, different in one or a few key aspects. So, okay, so in both we are going to be modeling the failure time of some electrical component. In this first prompt, that product is either manufactured in Iowa or Pittsburgh, but there is no difference in the quality. Okay? But the Iowa factory has been open for longer, and so only 5 years. So a component that comes out of Iowa, the longest survival time that it can have is 5 years, but it may continue to go beyond that, and so it gets censored at 5 years. Conversely, in Pittsburgh, it is only opened 2 years ago, and so they're censoring at 2 years. And so we want to know whether or not this censoring mechanism is independent. And so it's probably important to understand, what are we saying is independent of what? And the way that I take this is the city of manufacture, is that, well, and their resulting censoring times, 5 years and 2 years, is that independent of the outcome, which is the failure time of the electrical component? And in this case, I think that they are independent because we're told that there's no difference in quality. Okay? But I will say that there's a couple more twists and turns here, because no difference in quality, well, of course, that's an assumption that has to be made. We don't know that. That's just an assumption that's being made for the sake of the question. And so if that assumption is correct, then yeah, then this is not biasing. However, even if they were, it turned out that we assumed that they were the same, that there was no difference in quality, it's still okay, because we could condition on origin. Okay, and so we could, and so if we can condition away the biasing, problem, well, then we are conditionally independent at least, right? We condition on the thing that would otherwise cause bias, and therefore remove that bias, at least statistically, at least attempt to remove it statistically. So, okay. Now, in part I, we're again modeling failure time of electrical components in two factories, one of which opened before the other. And now we have reason to believe that there is a difference in quality. Okay? Well, this is the scenario that I was just painting in H, where now we're at least open to the idea that the two factories are not producing equivalent quality product. Now, is this independent or not? Well, all by itself, that would be a non-independent censoring mechanism. But because, presumably, we know where, Iowa or Pittsburgh, we know where the component is being manufactured, we can condition on that. And therefore, this is conditionally independent. So it's either not independent unless we condition on where the component was being made, in which case I believe it should be conditionally independent. Okay, that was a long one. So we'll see you next time.